Hey guys, Coach Pop. Thanks for joining me for the video cast for lesson 3.4. Today we're looking at the imperial patterns in India. And you might recall we had compared and contrast the pattern that emerged in Greece and Rome, and also looked at how both of those compared to the model set by the Achaemenids of Persia. But as we'll see, to the east of Persia, the patterns unfold in very different ways in India and China. So before we get into the classical period of India, let's go back to the ancient period. And you'll recall that the Indus Valley civilization is among the earliest core civilizations to emerge in Afro-Eurasia. And then you'll recall that the Indo-European migrations include these people called Aryans who will cross over the Indus Valley and into the northern part of what is now India. They are bringing with them a very different society than what the Indus Valley people practiced. The Aryans are pastoralists and they're warriors, and so their whole social system is very, very different. One of the intriguing questions is what happened to the Indus Valley civilization? We do know that climate change was making it increasingly harder for them to feed the people of the giant city states that they lived in. That was happening before the Aryans showed up. The sort of traditional account is the Aryans, being warriors on horseback, simply invaded and overwhelmed and conquered the Indus Valley peoples. But it's more likely that there was a kind of blending going on. Nonetheless, there are certain things that the Aryans bring with them. One has to do with their political system. It is a decentralized system involving local kings, many, many, many local kings. This map shows we're talking about 100, possibly hundreds of different kingdoms, all ruled by a local king who is practicing these beliefs that we'll talk more about, eventually known as Hinduism. But it's a very political, decentralized system. But they also bring their social system with them. And this is usually referred to as the caste system, and it's a very unusual type of thing. This is found initially in a series of hymns known as the Vedas, the oldest texts that were not written down for possibly millennia. We don't know exactly how long they were. But the basic social system involves two aspects. One of them is known as Varna. Varna is considered to be universal among all of the descendants of the Aryans. That is to say, it's the same, it's unchanging, nothing to do with that. Now, the story from the Vedas involves the first man named Purusha, and there was no other humans, and so the gods divided up his body, and the different varnas emerged from different parts of his body. This is a story we'll get into more next week when we start looking more closely at the cultural traditions going on. But the thing I want you to notice in this social hierarchy, the priests are at the top and the warriors are below them. That Kshatriya class, the warrior class, is where the kings come from. So we'll come back to this in just a moment because that's kind of unusual that the kings would actually be second on the social hierarchy. You've got merchants and landowners, the Vaishyas, the next group below. Those three are known as twice born because they all have to undergo this ritual that moves them from childhood to adulthood. So they're essentially born again as adults. The Shudras, the servants, though, at the bottom of that, do not have that. Then you'll notice the untouchables. Now, according to the story, the untouchables did not come from the body of Purusha. And so they are left to do all of the dirty work, and that's going to have all sorts of labor implications as well as social and cultural ones. But again, we'll come back to that more later on. But there's another aspect of the caste system known as jati. Jati is a local form of caste, and it involves what profession or job your family does. And this, again, we'll come back to more later on, but it's really unusual insofar as you don't get to pick what your job is. Your job is determined by your family line. Your last name determines what your job is. And there's all sorts of rules. You can only marry people within your jati. You can only dine with people within your jati. But what's unique about this is it changes from region to region throughout South Asia. So in one particular place, somebody, let's just say the last name Patel, they might be doctors, but in another place, the last name Patel is merchants. And so it's localized, but it's still very, very strict. This is the system that the Aryans bring with them, and it's sort of crystallized in something known as the Laws of Manu. Now, we think of laws as being a political document, but in the case of the Laws of Manu, it's really a social and cultural document. Manu was a Hindu sage, a Brahmin, and you'll notice he's depicted here laying back, and he's got this blue tint to him. In Indian iconography, that represents an avatar, and we'll talk more about this next week. He's an incarnation of a god. Many Hindus believe that Manu was actually an incarnation of the creator god Brahma. Nonetheless, he teaches these rules about how you're supposed to behave depending on your Varna, what is and is not allowed. And as we'll see next week, the consequences are literally extending over lifetimes. These laws of Manu, though, relate to the basic pattern. Oh, I should point out the laws of Manu existed for hundreds and hundreds of years as an oral tradition. They weren't actually written down until about 200 BCE. But the point is this: they politically, this system is a bunch, hundreds of local kings. But what unites all of them is the laws of Manu, these rules about how you are supposed to live depending on your caste. And so that sort of becomes the glue that keeps this civilization together, even though it's politically so fragmented for so much of its time. That will change, though, with the first of two empires that will emerge, the Maurya Dynasty. And if you look at this particular map, you'll notice the green area is what's conquered by its founder. His grandson extends the empire in the blue area. It controls most of South Asia, the exception being the southern tip of India, which, as we'll see, is a recurring theme. Nobody seems to be able to conquer that territory down there. And also note where its capital city is, Pataliputra. So the transitional figure then going from local kingdoms to an empire is this guy, Chandragupta Maurya. Now, please pay attention to this because you'll see there could be confusion here. His first name is Chandragupta. His family name is Maurya. He initially is the king of Pataliputra, this city, a very big and important city, but he's just a king. He leads his army into battle against a Greek general, Seleucus. And you might recall Seleucus was one of the generals of Alexander who was given the territory in the eastern part of what had been Persia after Alexander dies. He ends up in the wars of the Diadochi, just conquering all of the other Greek generals to form his own sort of empire. But he, in this battle with Seleucus, Chandragupta Maurya recognizes what Seleucus is up to. And so he is able to unite the local kingdoms to follow him. His argument is the only way we will keep the Greeks from invading and taking over our territory is we have to unify to become an empire to fight against the Greeks. And he succeeds in convincing everybody that that's what they've got to do. So if you think about it, there's this direct line about the idea of empire that goes from the Achaemenids to the Greeks and now to the people of South Asia. And so, in many ways, he sort of copies what the Persians did through the Greeks. He sets up an administrative system for this empire that divides the territory into provinces and then subdivides them into districts. He raises an army through requiring local kings to provide soldiers and pay taxes. So you can see there's a sort of direct line going all the way back to Persia. But as an old man, he ends up giving up his power as the emperor. The word for that is abdicate. He's not dead. He just decides he doesn't want to be emperor anymore. The reason for this is because he's kind of perplexed. He doesn't like that he's got to use force as the leader, and he converts to this new religion in South Asia called Jainism, which is a kind of blending. You can think of it as a blending between Hinduism and Buddhism. We'll talk more about that next week when we get into the religions, but the point is this: he simply steps down. His son will become the emperor, although, as we'll see, he doesn't reign very long. I believe he's killed in battle. I honestly don't remember. But what I do remember is this guy. Now, in India, he's called Chanakya. The Greeks called him Kautilya. So you'll see both versions of his name. It's the same guy. And he served as Chandragupta's advisor. Okay. But here's where it gets a little bit weird. Chanakya was a Brahmin. And Chandragupta Maurya was born as a Hindu. He's a member of the warrior class, the Kshatriyas, and then he becomes the emperor. So there's this kind of conflict because the Chandragupta is technically higher on the social hierarchy than the emperor is. Nonetheless, Chandragupta's advisor, Chanakya, is the one sort of telling him how he's supposed to do this. His ideas he will eventually write in a book called Arthashastra. And the translation in English is usually the treatise of material gain. But what you really need to know about it is it's a guide to using power. This is not some sort of abstract spiritual book. This is a book about how to use power to rule over other people. And his basic idea is that the greatest threat to anything good is anarchy. Like you have to have a strong central authority to prevent anarchy or everything is wasted. As a consequence, the ruler or would-be ruler has to use force if necessary. Now, that sort of comes back to the question of why Chandragupta Maurya gave up the throne. He's not comfortable with that. And it's true, he's an old man by the time he comes to that realization. But nonetheless, as we'll see, that's something that comes up again. The other thing, though, the other influence, and possibly equally, if not greater influence, is that Chanakya served as Ashoka's teacher. Ashoka is the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya. And Ashoka grows up learning how to use power from Chanakya, also known as Kautilya. He will eventually become the ruler, and he's known in history as Ashoka the Great. Ashoka Maurya expands the empire. Just as Chanakya taught him to do, you've got to go out, conquer territory, because that's what empires do. And he does it very well. But after one particular battle in which he wins, after the battle is over, he surveys the field on which the battle took place, and it's just littered with dead bodies, and he realizes he is responsible for all of that suffering, and he's very, very troubled by it. Consequently, he converts to Buddhism. Again, he was born a Hindu in the Kshatriya class, but he converts to Buddhism. Now, again, we'll get into the religions next week when we start looking at the cultural traditions. But the big idea here is in Buddhism, the central tenet is you have to eliminate suffering. This creates a conflict, a true conflict for Ashoka. I mean, he's troubled by this. On the one hand, his teacher is teaching him and telling him, hey, here's what you have to do to have and protect political power. But on the other hand, the Buddha, who he is now following, says, well, you've got to end suffering. You've got to eliminate desire. It's not hard to see that conflict. Like if you're the emperor on some level, you are inflicting suffering on certain people. But on the other hand, he believes his role as a Buddhist is to end suffering. How is he going to manage this problem? It's a genuine problem. What is he going to do? Well, he kind of comes up with this model that we haven't seen before, and I'm not sure we will see again. He's going to try to be a compassionate emperor. And in some ways, you can see this. It's a little bit like trying to be a chief. He's trying to get people to like him through charisma in order to follow his rules so that he doesn't have to use force. Well, how does he do that? Well, first thing, he is definitely going to try to expand the material benefits for all of the people in his realm. He does this by building a road system. Obviously, we can see an idea going all the way back to the Achaemenids. But like that, the official road system ends up building prosperity for many, many people. He also standardizes coins and weights and measurements. And you might not think this is a very big deal, but especially in a place like South Asia, if you have hundreds of kingdoms and every kingdom has their own coins, for example, that makes commerce a little bit difficult. Now the whole empire has one system of coinage. This is an example of a coin that is in fact Ashoka Maurya on the coin, but you can see it's very heavily influenced by the idea of the Greek coins. This brings material benefits for his people. What he's primarily focused on, though, is what he calls a spiritual revival of his people. And the way that he does this is through a series of edicts. Now, an edict is a word that's kind of similar to the idea of law, but you might think of it more accurately as policies. And if you look on this map, everywhere there is a triangle is a rock edict. Pillar edicts, as we'll see in a moment, are carved onto these long poles. The point is this: in these edicts, he is demonstrating compassion through the law. And the edicts are carved in many, many different languages, including, Sanskrit, the sort of the official language, if you will, but also in Greek, because, after Hellenization, so many people in Asia are speaking Greek. It's also in Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, because that's the most popular language in the Middle East. It's also in local languages, and he does this because he wants everybody to know that he's trying to create laws that show compassion. He's also practicing religious tolerance. He's not trying to convert people to Buddhism necessarily, but he's encouraging people, whatever your religious beliefs are, practice them to the best of your ability. His idea is if every individual is practicing their own spirituality, that will then provide a unified empire. Now, he does not convert people, but he does build these structures frequently with the pillar edicts called stupas. This is the remains of one here. That dome structure is a Buddhist shrine. So he's promoting Buddhism, but he's not, forcing people to convert. I will point out that pillar with I can't tell if that's a lion or a horse at the top. That is the types of pillars on which his edicts would be carved in many, many different languages for everybody to see. Guys, it's a very unusual way of being an emperor, but it works for him. Why? Because people genuinely like him. They respect him. And that's all cool, but when he dies, his descendants don't have that charisma. They're not able to keep everybody together. And within a few decades after Ashoka Maurya dies, the Mauryan dynasty crumbles. What happens then? they go back to being local kingdoms. For centuries, one of the things on the sheet, notice that the date here starts BCE and goes to CE. So how many years, exactly how many years did they go without another empire? Centuries, but specifically how many years? So now they're back to their sort of default setting of local kingdoms until we get the second empire, the Gupta Dynasty. Note its capital is also Pataliputra. That becomes one of the biggest cities in the world during the classical period. Note as well the territory that it controls, and if you notice, the yellow lines on that map are tributaries. That is to say, they control the local kings there through tribute, but it's technically not their own territory. But the key figure here is a guy named Chandra Gupta. Okay, I've warned you about this. Look at his name. His first name is Chandra. His family name is Gupta. Okay, don't confuse Chandra Gupta with Chandragupta Maurya. He is the guy that's sort of the key figure for the Gupta dynasty. He starts off, he's the king of Pataliputra. He conquers other kingdoms. So we've seen sort of this pattern before. Notice though that the Gupta empire, the dynasty of the Gupta, it's smaller than the Maurya, but it lasts longer uh, by hundreds of years. So I mean, is it more successful? Well, it depends on how you measure that. But one thing is true. This is the period which is known as the Hindu Golden Age under the reign of the Guptas. First of all, a lot of the oral texts that had existed in the tradition of Hinduism, which we'll again talk about more next week, are finally written down. And they were not written down for hundreds, maybe millennia, but the because the Brahmins didn't want them to be written down, because part of the training of a Brahmin was you had to memorize all of these texts. Nonetheless, they're finally written down under the Gupta, and they're benefiting from these extensive trade networks, as we'll see in just a moment. That is generating immense wealth for the Gupta dynasty. But what they do for a long period of time is then take that wealth and channel it into things we might call high culture. So, like art and architecture and literature. And it's just generating this Hindu golden age. Now, I should also point out there's something unusual going on with Buddhism at this time. Again, we'll get into this more next week. But Buddhism, while it starts in South Asia, is not really popular by this time. It's spreading and it becomes really popular in other parts, particularly East Asia and Southeast Asia. But there's something unusual going on there we'll come back to later on. In this map, what you see is how the Gupta Empire benefits from its geographical location. You'll notice to the north, there's this overland trade route we call the Silk Roads, and to the south is the Indian Ocean trade routes, and the Gupta are smack dab in the middle of this. Now, we're going to look more closely at all the trade routes going on, the networks, in a couple of weeks, but it's not hard to see how they are benefiting. All of that trade, they're right smack dab in the middle. That is generating immense wealth. And they're using that wealth to fund cultural achievements. Now, you don't need to know everything on this particular diagram, but look at it. Literature, Kalidasa, I will point out, is probably one of the greatest playwrights next to Shakespeare in the world, although most people in the West have never heard of him. This is also when the two great epic poems we'll talk about again more next week are finally written down. They had existed for probably, at least one of them, probably well over 1,000 years. In terms of astronomy, math, medicine, what we're going to see is as we go particularly for the rest of the first semester, a lot of the intellectual achievements that humanity makes, you can trace their origin back to India under the Gupta dynasty. I mean, consider the concept of zero. Like, it's crazy to think, how did anything work if you didn't have the concept of zero? The numbers, we call them our numerals, our Arabic numerals is what we call them, but we'll see they actually got them from the Gupta Dynasty. So all of these great achievements, cool, the Gupta dynasty is really cool. Nonetheless, all empires will fall. So what's going on with the Gupta? Well, internally, they have a series of rulers who are perceived to be really weak. They're more concerned about their own luxury, and they're seen as corrupt by people. And as a consequence, there's several rebellions that, again, rarely succeed, but they're definitely a sign of internal problems. Then you've got external problems, including invasions. These people we call them white Huns. The Greek word was Hephthalites. They're part of this group of people from Central Asia that we'll talk about more in a week and a half, who are constantly invading from the north and weakening the Gupta dynasty tremendously. There's also a decline of trade along the Silk Roads. And again, when we look more closely at trade networks, we'll come back to that. But when the volume of trade is declining, that geographical position that India is in, it's going to have an economic effect. And so they're just not generating the wealth that they did before. Put all this together, the Gupta dynasty's territory is shrinking a lot. Now, they technically still have a king for, a significant amount of time until officially 543, but the empire it's like a shell of its former self at that time. Then they go back to the default position, local kingdoms, for centuries. And there won't be another empire in South Asia until Islam arrives. But as we'll see, there's something unusual about how Islam affects the state systems in a particular territory. But again, the big idea is it goes back to local kingdoms for hundreds of years. So what is the basic pattern? If you look on your sheet, it says local kingdoms, intermittent empires. Intermittent means every once in a while. So the normal situation is local kingdoms, and every once in a while you get an empire in there. Now the word for this is decentralization. Most of the time, South Asia is decentralized. Every once in a while it gets centralized in the form of an empire. In the space at the bottom of the page, though, summarize what you think local kingdoms, intermittent empires means in your own words, but do use the word decentralization. In other words, what is the basic pattern in South Asia? Please do that before you come to class to get your stamp. I hope you were able to annotate everything. I appreciate you guys paying attention, and as always, I can't wait to see you in class.